The rain had a way of finding every gap in Daniel's jacket, sliding down his collar like cold fingers reminding him of everything he'd lost. He stood under the awning of a closed pharmacy on the corner of 5th and Miller, watching the streetlights blur into halos through the downpour, and did the math one more time. $11. A phone with 4% battery, and a father he hadn't spoken to in 3 years. 3 years ago, Daniel had walked out of Cedar House, the pale yellow farmhouse with the wraparound porch, where his father, Thomas Whitfield, had raised him alone after his mother passed. He'd walked out with his inheritance early, cashed out, certain, at 22, that he knew better than the quiet rhythms of that house. The 6 a.m. prayers, the smell of coffee and cut grass, the predictable Sunday dinners where his father asked the same question every week. "You doing all right, son?" As if all right were something you could simply decide to be. Daniel had wanted more than all right. He wanted noise. He wanted a city that didn't know his last name, didn't know he was the boy whose mother died of cancer when he was 9, didn't know he'd spent his teenage years being gentle with a grieving father, because someone in that house had to hold things together while the other one grieved. For the first year, the city gave him everything he asked for. He bartended in a club downtown, made friends who called him Wit and never asked about home, dated a woman named Sable who taught him how to disappear into a Friday night. The money from his inheritance disappeared faster than he expected. First into rent for an apartment too nice for what he earned, then into nights that blurred into each other, then into a habit he told himself he could stop anytime. He always could stop. He just never did. By the second year, Sable was gone. The good apartment was gone, and Daniel was renting a room above a laundromat from a man named Reyes, who didn't ask questions as long as the money showed up on time. Daniel worked odd jobs: dishwasher, day laborer, once 3 weeks stocking shelves at a warehouse before he got fired for showing up late too many times. He told himself this was temporary too. Everything was temporary until somehow it had been 3 years. By the third year, Daniel wasn't fighting to build a life anymore. He was fighting to survive the day. He pawned his watch, his father's watch actually, a plain steel thing that had been a gift for his 18th birthday. For $40 he spent in a single night. He told himself he'd buy it back. He never went back to that pawn shop again. Not because he forgot where it was, but because he couldn't stand to see it in the case, ticking away behind glass, a small monument to what he'd become. Tonight, standing under the pharmacy awning with rain soaking through his shoes, Daniel had reached the bottom of something he didn't have a name for. He'd asked Reyes for one more week on rent, and Reyes, not unkindly but firmly, had said no. He'd asked a man named Curtis, someone he used to run with, for $20, and Curtis had laughed and said, "Wit, you're not good for it anymore. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that." The words sat in Daniel's chest like a stone. He thought about his father then, not in the vague, guilty way he usually allowed himself to think of him, a flicker of shame quickly buried under something else, but fully, deliberately, the way you finally look directly at a wound instead of glancing away from it. He thought of Thomas Whitfield's hands, thick and sun-browned from 30 years of farming, folded during grace before dinner. He thought of the last conversation they'd had 3 years ago in the kitchen at Cedar House, sunlight cutting gold lines across the linoleum. "I'm leaving," Daniel had said. His father hadn't shouted. That was the thing Daniel remembered most, the absence of shouting. Thomas had simply looked at him for a long moment, the way he looked at a field before a storm, calculating what could be saved and what couldn't. "This is still your home," he'd said finally. "Whatever happens out there, this is still your home." Daniel had thought at the time that this was simply something fathers said, a script. He hadn't believed it carried any real weight, hadn't believed his father, a man of order, of rules, of 6 a.m. prayers, could possibly mean it unconditionally. Surely there was a limit. Surely there was a version of Daniel his father wouldn't want back. Standing in the rain now, Daniel believed he had become that version. He pulled out his phone, the screen cracked in the corner, battery blinking its last warning. He didn't type anything for a long time. What could he even say? "I'm sorry" felt too small. A coin dropped into a debt of miles. "I need help" felt too honest, too much like admitting the shape of the thing he'd built his life into. He thought about the parable his father used to read at the table sometimes, from the worn leather Bible with the cracked spine. The younger son who took his inheritance and wasted it, who came home rehearsing a speech about not being worthy to be called a son, only to see his father running toward him from a distance before a single word of confession had even been spoken. Daniel had always privately thought that story was too easy, too clean. Real fathers, he'd assumed, made you walk the whole road of shame first. Real fathers waited at the door with their arms crossed, letting you feel the weight of what you'd done before they decided whether to let you back in. But something in him, some small, stubborn ember he hadn't managed to drown out completely, wanted just once to find out if that story could be true for him too. He typed 4 words, "Dad, can I come home?" He sent it before he could delete it, and watched the phone's battery die a second later, the screen going black in his palm like a door closing. He didn't know if the message had gone through. He didn't know if his father would even answer, or if he'd answer with the kind of conditions Daniel felt he deserved. A list of terms, a probation period, a careful, measured welcome that kept him at arm's length until he'd proven himself again. He had no way to check. He had $11, a dead phone, and roughly 40 miles between himself and Cedar House. So Daniel started walking. It took him 2 days. He slept the first night in a bus shelter, the second in the loading dock of a grocery store, waking stiff and hungry and increasingly unsure whether this whole plan was foolishness. Twice he almost turned back toward the city, certain that whatever waited for him at Cedar House would be colder than the rain, that his father's silence. No reply had come, of course, with the phone dead, meant something final, but he kept walking, because turning back meant admitting he had nowhere left to go at all, and some fragile part of him still needed, more than he needed food or a dry bed, to know the truth about that house. To know whether this is still your home had been a father's convenient sentence or a father's unbreakable promise. By the third morning, footsore, unshaven, wearing clothes that hadn't been properly washed in a week, Daniel came over the last hill on the county road and saw it. Cedar House, pale yellow against the green, smoke curling thin and steady from the kitchen chimney the way it always had, even in summer, because his father liked the smell of a lit stove. Daniel stopped at the top of the hill. A quarter-mile of gravel road still between him and the porch. His legs suddenly felt made of something other than muscle. He thought of every rehearsed sentence he'd built during 2 days of walking. I know I don't deserve to just walk back in. I'll work the fields. I'll sleep in the barn if you want. I just need you to know I'm sorry. And I understand if that's not enough. And found that his throat had closed around all of them. He almost turned around then, standing at the top of that hill, looking down at the house that held every good memory he had left. Daniel was struck by a fear larger than any he'd felt in the city. Not the fear of failing, but the fear of finally being fully seen, dirt and shame and all, by the one man whose good opinion had ever really mattered. That was when the porch door opened. Thomas Whitfield stepped out first, the way he always did when checking the weather. A habit of 30 years farming this land, scanning the sky before he scanned anything else. But this time his eyes came down from the clouds and landed on the hill, on the small, stooped, unmistakable shape of his son standing at the top of the gravel road. Daniel would remember for the rest of his life what happened next in fragments, because it happened too fast for him to hold on to as a single, complete memory. His father did not fold his arms. He did not wait on the porch, weighing whether to walk down and meet the moment on his own careful terms. Thomas Whitfield came off that porch at a dead run, work boots slapping against wet gravel, arms already open before he'd covered half the distance, calling Daniel's name not in anger but in a voice cracked wide open with something that sounded impossibly like joy. Daniel had spent 2 days rehearsing an apology. He managed only the first few words. "Dad, I'm sorry, before his father reached him and pulled him into an embrace so full and immediate that it knocked the rest of the sentence clean out of him. Thomas didn't ask where he'd been. He didn't ask about the money, or the years, or the watch that never came home. He held his son the way you hold something you were afraid you'd lost for good, and said only, again and again, into Daniel's shoulder, "You're home. You're home now. Thank God you're home." Daniel stood there in his father's arms on the gravel road, 3 years of shame sitting heavy in his chest, waiting, some old bruised part of him still waiting for the moment his father would pull back and start the accounting, the conditions, the list of what needed to change before he could really be welcomed back. It never came. Later that afternoon, after a shower and a shirt that used to be Daniel's and still hung, a little large, in the closet of his childhood room, his father set 2 plates on the kitchen table without a word about probation or proof. He simply said, "Grace," the same 6 words he'd always said, "Lord, thank you for this family," and passed the bread. It was Daniel, not his father, who finally broke the silence over dinner. "You didn't even let me finish," he said quietly. "The apology, you didn't wait to hear it." Thomas set down his fork and looked at his son with the same steady expression Daniel remembered from the kitchen 3 years ago. The look of a man who had already decided something and wasn't going to be talked out of it. "I didn't need to hear it to know it was true," he said. "And I wasn't going to make you carry it all the way up that hill by yourself. You'd already carried enough." Daniel looked down at his plate, throat tight. "I thought you'd be ashamed of me." "I was never waiting to shame you, son," Thomas said, quiet and certain, the way he said things he'd clearly thought about for a long time, maybe for 3 long years. "I was just waiting for you. There's a difference. I watched that road every single evening since you left, not because I thought you'd fail out there and I'd get to say I told you so. I watched it because I never stopped believing you'd come back. And I didn't want you walking that last stretch alone if I could help it." Outside, the sun was dropping behind the tree line, throwing long gold light across the kitchen floor. The same light Daniel remembered from the day he left, only now it didn't feel like the light of an ending. It felt like the light of something finally, fully begun. Daniel understood then, sitting in his father's kitchen with clean clothes on his back and forgiveness he hadn't earned sitting warm in his chest, why his father had run. Not to catch him before he could escape again. not to make sure he faced consequences immediately. He had run because love, real love, does not sit comfortably behind a closed door, counting up a debt. It runs, it closes distance, it reaches you before your shame has the chance to convince you that you're too far gone to be reached at all. That night, Daniel lay in his old bed, listening to the familiar creak of the house settling, the distant call of an owl in the cedar trees his father had planted the year Daniel was born. He thought about the parable his father used to read, the running father, the son who never finished his rehearsed speech. He understood now that the story had never been too easy. It had simply been true, truer than Daniel had let himself believe, until the day he finally stopped waiting at the bottom of the hill for shame, and let himself be found instead by something running toward him with open arms.